Hello everybody. So I thought I would take some time to do a little talking video. And if you saw the name of this, then you probably know that what we're going to get into today might be a little controversial in subject matter. And so basically what's going to happen in this video is I'm going to express some points. You might disagree with me, but no matter which side of this argument you fall on, you probably won't like what I have to say. So I look forward to that. That'll be great. I should have called this video a video in which I say some things and probably make no one happy. So it should be a lot of fun. And what I want to talk about today is why Age of Sigmar is probably, maybe, soften that a little, the best and worst edition of Warhammer ever. So how could it be both of those things at once? Well, let me start at the very beginning. I love Age of Sigmar. If you don't, that's cool too. There's lots of great games out there, and you don't have to love every one of them. But I love it. I've played it quite a bit, had a lot of fun with it. I really, really enjoyed it. And it's funny because in playing it, it's sort of made me realize and brought to a war game something that I've come to value in my role-playing side of my hobby recently over the past couple years, which is the value of a simplicity of rule sets with larger options to explore. Um, but regardless of whether or not you agree with me on that statement, that it is a lot of fun, that is to say, I thought we would talk about what is Age of Sigmar first. We gotta set that up. So most of you who are watching this probably have some idea of what the game is, so I won't belabor that a lot. But I think that there are some truisms to it. The rules, at least as offered in the base sort of setup, are more simple. That is simply true. I think it is also a faster game. It tends to play extremely well at smaller levels than old Warhammer. There is a lot of complexity to the game. There is a lot of tactics to the game, but as written in sort of the base component of the thing, it's fairly simple what's going on. And if you play it at a small scale, that is to say, with not a whole lot of models on the board, it will play out fairly simple. The complexity comes through things like the individual war scrolls and rules, and layering on scenarios and different objectives and things like that. So I think those things are mostly true and to some degree non-controversial. That is to say, simpler than say previous editions and faster than previous editions. And I've heard a lot of complaint about the nature of the changing of the rules. So a lot of the sort of fury in the community since the release of Age of Sigmar has stemmed from the change of the rules, whether the person who's playing feels that, or who is upset feels that it's more simple, or it's just not the same rules, or whatever. They felt that that is crippling. And when people attack AOS, they often say that this change of the rules is so bad and it's ruined the game and whatever. And that it can't be successful with these rules. Okay. So I want to get into that first. So here is the secret of game design. Rules don't really matter. Okay? And that is to say, they don't matter much. They matter a little. They don't matter much. And that's a really hard pill to swallow, because it feels like they should matter a lot. But I promise you, if you look at the history of gaming, they don't. Okay? They matter some, but not much. And they're certainly not the top thing that matters in the success or failure of a game. They might not even be in the top 3. If they are, they're number 3. So let me offer some proofs for that. Okay? Most of the most successful games sort of on the market rarely have the best rules. let's point to a couple in the role-playing game industry, which is where I cut my teeth and am much more familiar. Uh, let's look at Dungeons and Dragons and Rifts. So at the end of the 90s, those games were, or somewhere in the 90s, depending on when you pick, those games were number one, number two, number three. They were up there. They were titanically successful games. And arguably their rule sets were not great. Dungeons and Dragons has never built itself on the really until, and maybe even now, 5th edition has a really pretty tight rule set, probably one of the best of all time. But certainly the oldest editions of D&D did not have an incredibly well thought out rule set. I happen to love them, but they're not great by any standards of rules writing. They're often arcane, esoteric, conflicting. They have lots of questions and space in them that just led to numerous FAQs. So there was in Dragon Magazine, which was a monthly magazine for D&D for a very long time, there was an entire multi-page spread in every magazine dedicated solely, called Sage Advice. At one point it had other names, but dedicated solely to answering questions about how the game worked. It was very complicated, misplayed almost universally in some regard. Like, that is to say, if you were playing the game, you were probably doing something wrong. And just endless questions were raised, and that didn't matter a whit. It was a juggernaut, and still is to this day, because even in any regard, it is simply the king of the RPG market. Whether you're talking 5e or or D&D rebranded Pathfinder, those two things simply dominate. The number of units they move is just beyond anything else in the market. And they've never really had amazing rules. Rifts is another great example. So you have basically a single creator system under Kevin Sambiata, whose name I'm probably mispronouncing, and I apologize. He's a very, very brilliant guy. And that rule set is, let's call it an homage to second edition Dungeons and Dragons, and it's probably even more of a train wreck than than any of those older editions of D&D. And that didn't matter. Didn't matter at all. Those rules were just absolutely opaque. And it was hugely successful for a really long time. And by the way, still is to this day. Maybe not at its height, but still a very successful game that a lot of people play and love. The entire Palladium system actually would fall under this. But, Rifts is probably the juggernaut of all of those Palladium games. And that's true just across the board. There's a lot of reasons for this. First off, Hooves of Doom put up a great video about why Games Workshop should be a miniatures company, and you should all go watch that. That's number one. So just in case you're not angry enough after watching my video, you can watch his and get more angry too. But I think it's a fantastic video, and he makes a horde of good points. But he raised a question in there about rules, and he said he didn't think they were you're not able to legally protect rules. I will answer, but he wasn't sure. I'll answer the question. You cannot. There is no legal protection for rules. You cannot trademark them or anything like that. That game mechanics, at least in the United States, I don't know international laws, but at least in the United States, cannot be legally protected. Okay? And the line is anything that can be algorithmically derived. Okay, so an easy example here to put this in very concrete terms, if you think of the weapon skill table in Warhammer, in 8th edition and previous, that could not be legally protected. Because I can give you an algorithm to calculate that out, right? Exactly what number you needed to hit based on the inputs of X and Y. The only thing you can legally protect are game mechanics that are numerically, I don't want to say randomly divined or created, but that don't have any algorithmic underpinning. Okay, so again, an easy example of this is, if you're familiar with 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons, the saving throw chart against things like poison and paralysis and spells and stuff like that. there's no math to that. That's just darts at the wall, basically, as far as numbers go. And that could be legally protected. Everything else that's not those two things is kind of in some weird middle ground. And what that means is that people can very easily write rule sets that are very close to yours. Again, as I mentioned, Rifts really has a lot of things in common with second edition D&D and how a lot of stuff resolves. Doesn't matter. I mean, TSR, who was very litigious, never went after them because they knew they didn't have a leg to stand on. So the other problem is that rules require expertise. You have to be able to read an entire rule set, comprehend it, understand how the components work together, and then place those in context of the experience during the game. None of that matters in the sales process of a game, of picking up a game, of trying a game. Now, that's why I said rules matter some, because if the rules are utter garbage, okay, and you're trying to learn it and you can't even do it, if it's just the bottom of the barrel, and you play the game and it's not working, or it's so hard to figure out that it just kind of implodes, then they matter a lot. They matter for everything. But once you get to like functional, you get a huge diminishing marginal utility on rules and their quality. So like corner case questions, if those aren't answered, it's not going to matter because you're going to get probably some number of games in of whatever it happens to be. This is true for like board games, card games. It's really not a war game dependent thing. Before you ever come into those situations and raise the question. And in addition to that, humans have this great capability to think they know the answer to anything. I don't know is a very hard response for humans to give. So it's easy for them to just interpret it. And if they happen to vote, if both people playing or any number of people playing happen to interpret it, or one of them says, oh yes, the answer is this, most people would just tend to accept it. So you can get even another step back before you really run into that stuff mattering. Generally, it only really comes into play at like high levels of competitive play, where it can decide very important things, right? If you think about the way like street basketball is played versus say the NBA or any sport at sort of just you and your friends level versus high level competitive play where like rules need to be followed very critically and carefully because there's lots of money and important things riding on it. So that's kind of the difference there. But for the majority of the game experience and the success of the game, rules are just less important. So writing big rule books that have like lots of complex coverage of all these scenarios actually hurts you in selling your game because that makes it raises the barrier of entry and makes it harder for people to actually adopt the game. There's more that they have to understand, comprehend, contextualize, and then experience, right? What really sells games and what really interests people is generally the sort of feel of the game, and that's a weird term, and it's very complex, and like I have other videos talking about it, but it's some weird amorphous mixture of the fluff, the general impression, artistic tone, in the case of war games, the quality of the models and things like that. It's kind of all that shoved together. Everything I can really get a handle on quickly. I can walk into a store and see it, flip through a book. So again, to return to an RPG, you could have the best rules in the world, but if I flip through your book and your art is a bunch of crap, you're not going to be successful. That's unfair, but the truth. Because when people just flip through that big 200, 300 page RPG book, they're not internalizing those rules. They're just looking at the pretty pictures. And if those pretty pictures are awesome and seem to create a world that's compelling, they're going to go deeper, right? So the other problem that we run into with rules, and sort of larger arcane rule sets, is that they just really don't work in the modern market. So there's just too much competition for your attention. One of the interesting, like there's a good saying that Warhammer Fantasy population skews older. There's probably a good reason for that, in that you needed to have sort of luxury time to be able to internalize and contextualize those rules. Also, people of my age cohort and older probably don't have as many distractions where we're spending any amount of time on or as much time on games on our phone and Instagram and making vines and whatever else the kids do today, right? The younger audience who you need to attract, because that's how your game is successful at a mass market level, at a big level, has a lot of competition for their attention. And there was a really great podcast. There's a great podcast called Fear the Boot, which is about a lot of different game design stuff. And a long time ago, they had a long time, 4 years ago, they had an interview with Ryan Dancy, and who is a sort of personal hero and game designer. And he said in there that when he was looking at RPGs, he was sort of talking about RPGs at that moment, but he said that old style traditional RPGs are almost impossible to be really successful unless they have a huge weight of tradition behind them, because they just don't, they're not going to attract new people. Or if they do, the person will pick it up. They'll play it a little bit, but it's not going to become some major thing where they get together once a week and spend 6-8 hours playing the game and so on and so forth, like I play D&D. So between all this competition for attention and the fact that you need to be able to internalize these things quickly, smaller, simpler, faster rule sets are what you need to be successful at a mass market level. And the key to that is that Games Workshop is playing in that arena. They're a huge company by the standards of the game industry. They've traditionally been one of the larger games within that space, depending on how you cut it. And they're a publicly traded company. They have responsibilities to their shareholders and all these sorts of things. And if they don't deliver at a mass market level, they fail. They simply don't have the same luxury to produce those niche things, or to have their flagship title be that niche thing. They can do small niche games, but it can't be their flagship title. That smaller companies can. So here's an easy example. Again, to move over to the RPG space, just because it's easy. So Burning Wheel is a really, really amazing RPG system. And back in, again, this came out of this Dancy interview, there was sort of they came out with a new edition sometime like 11, 12, whatever. And the author had said that between when he made the book and when he was doing the remake, he sold something like 8,000 copies. Now, that's one of the most successful sort of independent publisher games of that time period. That is nothing. That is a drop, that is a tear in rain compared to what the big boys play in, right? If any of those larger companies sold that number of games, it would be just a night. It would be an utter failure. They would be packing up shop, heads would roll. But for him, that's amazing. He's the top of his particular heap. So these big complex games, it's not that they can't work or that they can't be successful. They can, just unfortunately not for a company at the size of Games Workshop. By the way, if I'm looking down, I have notes, so I apologize. So all of these things that I've said so far should support the idea that moving to AOS is sort of the best possible decision that they could have made, right? I mean, that seems like what I've been arguing and why it's the best game, right? But why am I also wrong? So now we're going to turn to why this could be also the worst thing they've done. And I don't think it's for most any of the reasons that have been said in sort of all the angry videos. First of all, let me just say this. I don't think Games Workshop doesn't care about its customers and all that. I have a video out there called Respecting Games Workshop. You can go watch it. I think they're a really good company, and I think they really do care. I just think that they, at the same time have responsibilities and have to be successful. I wouldn't begrudge them that. But I think that there are a lot of risks inherent to this, and I think it's things that we're not thinking about or that haven't been discussed as much. So everything I've said thus far is that what the mass market needs, what a company of their size needs, is a smaller, faster, easier game that works, that can be built up and become complex if necessary through all these bolt-on things, but is easy for people to pick up because what sells it is cool models and a cool story and a cool world and all that, right? That's sort of that feel thing. That's what really sells the game. So by all accounts, they've made all the right decisions. So it should be best, right? But here's my fear, and this is coming from the point of view, again, of somebody who loves this game and wants it to be as successful as possible, and hopes that many people play it and enjoy it if it's something that turns out that they like. So I mentioned earlier that Dancy said the weight of tradition, right? That these big things can only be successful because of the weight of tradition. So there's something underneath that. People tend to play what they're familiar with. That's how lesser rule sets that might be first in the market win. Doesn't matter that someone comes out with new, better, flashier rules. Again, I'm never going to read it all. I'm never going to interpret it, learn it, contextualize it, and play it enough, probably, to realize why it's superior. I'm already doing this thing. I know this thing. There's zero cost for me to continue doing this thing. I'd rather just accept the downside of it, right? And keep going rather than spend the cost of learning something new. This is not weird. We do this in every aspect of our life. Think of the last time you accepted anything like that, like your car was making a squeaking noise and you didn't bother to go fix it because you were like, nah, I can put up with that. Going to the mechanic's a lot of trouble and cost money and all that. This squeaking noise is free, right? I'll just put up with it. The car works, I'm happy. And that tradition has a lot of weight, right? Look at like Hollywood is the easiest example. Consider the biggest movie of this year so far. When I'm doing this, 2015. I don't know when you're watching this. Maybe it's tonight or tomorrow or whatever, but maybe it's a year from now. So the biggest movie so far was Jurassic World. Now we're pre-Star Wars when I'm recording this, so we'll see. But Jurassic World, by all accounts, probably not an amazing movie. That is to say, there were better movies this year, whatever that means. I don't want to get into that. But it's the most successful. Why? Well, because people tend to do and go to and invest their dollars and such into what they're familiar with. I mean, that's sequels and reboots and all that. That's people's big complaint with Hollywood. But it worked. Jurassic World is huge, and that's because it's trading on the legacy of Jurassic Park, and it's, by all accounts, pretty good. So it's not crap, basically. It's not great, but it's good enough. My fear is that that Age of Sigmar is so different and such a different experience that it does violate that tradition. Obviously, there's been a big fracturing of the community, and there's lots of people who played Warhammer, I would say religiously, to probably not abuse that term, who have since left the hobby or are trying other games or whatever. And there's going to need to be a huge influx of new people to cover that. I don't know what that percentage is, or what that number looks like. I have no idea, but it's a lot. I know that. It's a big one. It's a big number. It's not a small number. And that's dangerous because there's no weight of tradition behind it. Everybody was sort of given a free license to reconsider their hobby, right? And lots of people did. They were just you sort of played Warhammer with the idea that there might be other games out there that are quote unquote better rules wise than say 8th edition, which was I think even the most ardent supporters would admit was not a perfect game. But who cares? It's good enough, right? And in allowing people and giving them license to go explore that, people are discovering that there's other games out there on the horizon and playing them in mass, and they might not come back to yours at all. And that's a dangerous thing for it to happen for a company, to make that big of a change. The obvious paradigm equivalent here, the sort of where this has happened before, I would put my finger on something like Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition versus 4th edition, which, if you know anything about that, represented a similar big shift. The game was faster, simpler, played easier. There were less rules to interpret. And there are lots of really big fans of that game, but ultimately it wasn't successful because too many people felt it wasn't D&D. And that leads me to my next point. Fourth Ed as a pure rule set is probably better than third. Okay, probably better than anything that had come before it. Again, speaking solely from a rules perspective. I don't want to get into any edition wars of D&D. It was very cleanly written. It had a very little gray space. How you resolved everything was fairly straightforward. So by all accounts, those are all good things. Everything was very balanced, right, across the system. The problem was it wasn't D&D because some part of the feel, or for a lot of people, some part of the feel of D&D was the bad stuff. And I wonder if that's not the case for Warhammer. I'm not sure it is, but that's one of my fears. So with Dungeons and Dragons, there is sort of this thing that there are these weird things that, wizards can be really powerful in certain situations and imbalanced, and that magic items can do wonky, crazy things, and that fighters can be just unreasonably tough and withstand oodles of punishment or whatever. You can pick whatever if you've ever played the game, you can pick whatever weird thing you like. When all that went away and the imbalance was gotten rid of, and a lot of what most people would have considered bad game design was drained from the system, people found that the game no longer felt like the game. So anybody who's a fan of Scrubs, there's a great moment with Dr. Kelso where he talks about how his wife snores. And for years, he tried to get her to stop snoring, and she went to the doctor and all this. And nothing helped. She just snored, like sawing lumber. And occasionally he travels for business. He tells you he goes to conferences or whatever. And what he's come to realize is that now he can't sleep without that sound, right? So snoring is not optimal. It's not the best case scenario for sleeping, but his story is that this thing that is at prima facie considered bad has become such a part of his life that he's lesser without the bad thing. He's not only accepted it, but it's become almost a good thing. I think that's instructive. I know that seems like a far afield analogy, but I worry that happened with D&D. I worry that maybe that's the same case with Warhammer. That maybe those weird arcane rules and all of these strange complex interactions and janky movement and silly the giant can't hit somebody standing right next to him or whatever. Again, pick your poison. I don't want to get into the specifics. Sort of is one of the things that made Warhammer Warhammer. I don't know that that's the case. I'm just saying that that's one of the things that could make it, that's dangerous. There's that feeling, and it's been risked. Now, this is always my pushback when people say they want perfect balance and stuff like that, or they want a more balanced game. I don't think they do. I've seen too many games that went to things where it's really balanced, and A, that's chasing the dragon, and B, you probably don't, because then you wouldn't feel like you're playing Warhammer, would be my argument. So Age of Sigmar might in the end up like 4th Ed in that it's too balanced, if that's possible. Again, I don't know, but those things could happen. So the final point I want to make about it, and it can just to continue the feel of the game thing, is the idea of the fluff change. So if the rules change was necessary for success in the market, you almost have to ask them, fine, I accept all that. Let's say you're on board with me 100% to this point. You're probably not, but that's okay. Let's just imagine you are. I think it's still reasonable to ask the question, why the fluff change? And Maturin was really sort of out ahead of this and had brought this up early, and I think a lot of other people were just, whatever, it's fine. But something about the fluff of that world, of that old world, was really strange, but gritty, but grokkable. It was sort of this through the lens darkly of our world. It had these analogies to history and to mythology and to fantasy we knew, and it was recognizable, and realistic is the wrong word. It was not realistic in any way, shape, or form, but it had a really solid verisimilitude to it. where you could understand most of the forces in the world and kind of how they worked and the nations that they had and why they did what they did, their motivations. And all of that really was a big part of the feel of the game. And I don't think we know what the feel of Age of Sigmar really is yet from that perspective. I mean, we've seen a lot of like crazy blood warriors and some dudes in gold armor, and I don't think that's enough to judge the whole game of what it feels like. At this point, what the game feels like is still, fluff-wise, is still Warhammer 8th edition, because that's what all the figs I see on my table are. They're all still people running around, and it's all still Tomb Kings and stuff like that. My Skaven and things like that. That look like they walked out of 8th edition because they are. They all still have their adornments and their those kind of things. But over time, if that changes, then again, I worry about that feel. Will it, that new feeling, whatever it is, whatever Age of Sigmar turns out to have, will that be compelling enough to draw people in the same way? Because it's much more just, what you see in the books is much more unusual and out there. If I'm a fan of saying, again, to take it all back to D&D, I think I'm showing my roots here, but the old world felt like a Greyhawk or a Forgotten Realms. The new world feels like a Planescape. Now, I loved and love still to this day Planescape and have a massive collection of those second edition books, but it was a weird world and it wasn't successful in the mass market, not even close, because it was so out there and strange, which made it great for people like me who wanted something like that, who wanted something unusual. But most people don't. That weight of tradition again. So, that right there is why I simultaneously think that Age of Sigmar might be the best and the worst thing that Games Workshop could have done. So you probably agree and disagree with me, and that's okay. I welcome all of that. I love good conversation about it. I hope that you thought this was interesting. These are just some thoughts that have been bouncing around in my head. I'm actually going to link that Who's video down below as well. You should check him out. He's been responding to a lot of the topics of the week, and I really appreciate that, and he made a great video there that I think really covers a lot of good points that are adjacent to what I'm saying. So check that out. I'll also link the Fear the Boot podcast, just in case you're curious and you want to go listen to Ryan Dancy. He's a really brilliant guy. One of my favorite sort of people in the gaming industry over the past 15 years. He's also an extremely controversial figure, so you may already have opinions about him, but it's a great podcast, and they really talk about a lot of fun stuff. So I'll put both of those links below. Hope you like them. I hope you enjoyed this video very much. As always, I very much appreciate you watching and commenting. I love interacting with everybody. Subscribe if you haven't already. Like if you like the video. And by all means, please, let's continue the discussion below. But as always, thanks, and we'll see you next time.